the Forgotten Kingdom of Asturias, where monks, bears, and noblewomen shared the hills. Hey guys, I'm Lauren, the one who leads you to the magical kingdom through the slumber scroll. Tonight, we slip through the damp mists of northern Iberia, where the mountains crouch like sleeping giants and the valleys echo with forgotten chants. To all the studious children, before bedtime, we offer you a kingdom that wasn't supposed to survive, one that begins not in a palace, but in a cave. The rocks are wet, the air smells of moss and sheep, and your future king is holding a sword that's just a bit too rusty to be ceremonial. The year is around 718, and the Visigoths, those eyeliner-wearing kings of old, have been completely overrun by the advancing forces of the Umayyad Caliphate. Most of Iberia has fallen into Muslim rule, save for the craggy north, where the mountains are too steep and the sheep too moody to conquer easily. You arrive in Covadonga, a cave tucked deep in the Picos de Europa. Inside, it smells of damp wool, old incense, and nervous ambition. A small gathering of nobles, monks, farmers, and probably someone who just wandered in for shelter are discussing leadership, very loudly, and with very little agreement. Then someone points to Pelayo. He's not the most obvious choice. Historians still argue whether Pelayo was a nobleman from the Visigothic court, a disgruntled page, or simply the last man standing with a working sword. But tonight, under a patch of dripping stalactites and beside a badly carved wooden cross, Pelayo is declared king. No crown, no feast, just a muttered prayer, a handshake from a monk whose beard could use its own postal code, and a sense of, well, it's us or no one. This is the birth of the Kingdom of Asturias. Outside, the weather makes a strong case for moving south. Rain drizzles, fog rolls in like a judgmental grandmother, and your boots sink slightly into the moss. But Pelayo isn't here to move. He's here to fight. Not by marching on cities, but by digging in his heels and refusing to leave the hills. The Battle of Covadonga comes soon after. You're standing shoulder to shoulder with shepherds, monks, and one man who brought a rake instead of a weapon. The enemy forces sent by the Umayyad governor are better armed, better trained, and incredibly confused about the terrain. As arrows fly, you crouch behind a boulder that might also be a shrine. Pelayo leads the counterattack from above, using cliffs, caves, and sheer grumpiness as his weapons. The Asturian fighters shout in a mix of Latin, local dialects, and probably a few improvised curses. Miraculously, it works. The Umayyad troops retreat, some slipping on moss, others probably just tired of getting beamed by rocks. The victory isn't large, but it's loud, enough to send a message across the hills. The north is not ready to fall. Back in the cave, you sit beside a fire lit with damp wood and good intentions. The monks are already chanting. A woman from the village brings goat cheese, and Pelayo, still wiping mud off his tunic, nods solemnly, like a man who just realized he owns a kingdom without plumbing. The chronicles will later describe this moment with great flair. But here, in the cold, with wet socks and hopeful hearts, it feels less like destiny and more like defiance wrapped in homespun. So, before you drift off into the deep sleep of knowledge, don't forget to like and subscribe, but only if you believe in Slumber Scroll. Post your location and the time you're listening. We like to know where our sleepy nobles reside. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wrap yourself in a woolen cloak that still smells faintly of smoke and thyme. Outside, the wind begins to hum through the trees, a lullaby for kingdoms born in caves and guarded by fog. Morning drips in slowly through the mist like a guest who forgot their invitation. You stretch beneath a blanket that's mostly sheep and a little mildew, and breathe in the scent of smoke, damp moss, and something being toasted with only marginal success. It's monastery breakfast, barley bread, and goat's milk, served by men in robes who speak more Latin than common sense. You follow the scent uphill to a squat stone building, clinging to a cliffside like a determined limpet. This is one of the early Asturian monasteries, built not for grandeur, but for survival. The walls are thick, the roof leaks a bit when the wind whistles just right, and the scriptoria, where monks spend hours copying manuscripts, smells like ink, wax, and faintly singed wool. These monks are not the delicate, scholarly types from illuminated manuscripts. They are mountain monks. They have calluses from both prayer and chopping firewood, and they sing vespers like men who are trying to outshout the wind. You enter the scriptorium just as Brother Julian sneezes into a psalter. He mutters an apology, scratches out the now unholy blot, and continues writing. His Latin is impeccable. His spelling, less so. The walls are lined with wooden shelves, scrolls, and a peculiar diagram of what might be either a theological argument or a goat. Historians still argue whether these monasteries were truly autonomous or subtly under royal influence. But here, it feels like they answer only to the weather and whichever saint they happen to like best. You're offered a quill. It's made from a goose feather and smells faintly of garlic. You decline politely, having seen what happened to the last visitor who tried to help. Their queue was mocked for weeks. Outside, Brother Tello tends a small herb garden. The air buzzes with bees, who are both livestock and spiritual companions. Honey is sacred here, not just food, but an ingredient in medicine, ink, and theological metaphors. You try a spoonful from a waxy comb and immediately understand why a jar of this was once used to bribe a bishop. Further down the path, you encounter the monastery's most unusual resident, a bear. He's old, mildly disinterested, and lounging beneath a plum tree like someone who's worked retail for too many years. The monks call him Gregorio. He once wandered into the monastery kitchens, sampled the broth, and stayed. He's now something of a mascot. You freeze, but Brother Tello just nods and throws him a bruised pear. Gregorio grunts, accepts the offering, and resumes his nap. The other animals aren't far behind. A donkey with an attitude problem, chickens that refuse to lay eggs unless sung to, and a cat who may or may not be a heretic depending on who you ask. The monastery hums with an odd, peaceful chaos, like a choir that never agreed on key, but somehow makes it work. You sit down for a midday meal, lentils, barley, and bread, so dense it could double as a weapon. The conversation turns to Saint Beatus, a local scholar who once wrote a vivid commentary on the apocalypse. He filled the margins with dragons, fire, and stern-looking angels. The monks here have a copy, mostly intact, though a few pages were nibbled by mice. Or possibly Gregorio. As the sun drifts westward, you wander through the quiet halls. A novice scrubs the stone floor with salted water. Another is teaching himself Greek by reciting words to the rhythm of his own footsteps. You peek into a side chamber and find a shrine to a saint whose name no one remembers, but who's good with livestock. Someone's left a miniature wooden goat as an offering. Later that evening, Vespers begin. The monks chant as the sky darkens, their voices layering over each other in soft waves. The candles flicker. The air smells of pine and melted beeswax. You sit quietly at the back, wrapped in wool, unsure if you're praying or just profoundly calm. And just as the last chant fades, Gregorio lets out a snore that shakes the floorboards. You sleep that night in a cell beside the scriptorium, lulled by the creaking wood, the rustle of parchment, and the knowledge that, for one odd, peaceful night, you are sharing a roof with both saints and bears. The trouble starts, as it often does in Asturias, with a chicken and a locked gate. You're helping carry a basket of lentils up to a hilltop fortress when a rather haughty-looking hen, belonging to a noblewoman named Countess Adosinda, escapes from the kitchen yard and launches itself into a barrel of dried fish. No one's impressed, least of all the Countess herself, who emerges from the great hall with a firm grip on both dignity and a very sharp wooden spoon. Adosinda isn't the kind of noble who sits quietly by the hearth, sighing over tapestries. No, she's the sort who organizes militia drills between embroidery lessons and refers to her warhorse as my idiot third son. Historians still argue whether she ever held formal military command, but oral tradition and the frightened looks from passing squires strongly suggest yes. The fortress itself is more stubborn than grand. Perched like a brooding cat on a granite outcrop, it looks down over a valley where clouds roll in like gossip. The walls are thick, the doors heavier than necessary, and the only warm room is the kitchen, where a girl is currently trying to wrestle a boiling kettle off a fire before it explodes into someone's lunch. You're shown to the outer courtyard, where archery practice is underway. The targets, shields, barrels, and one extremely unfortunate turnip effigy of a Moorish commander. A boy hits the nose and is given a biscuit. You manage to hit your own boot and are politely asked to observe instead. Adosinda strides through the training yard with the sort of presence that makes grown men stand straighter and chickens hide. She doesn't shout. She just raises an eyebrow. Even the wind seems to adjust its behavior around her. You're invited to dinner, which is served in what used to be a storage room, and now functions as a combination feasting hall, war council chamber, and spinning circle. Tonight's menu: stew, flatbread, a mild lecture on siege survival, and a brief scolding about the state of the drawbridge. 3 creeks is too many, she says, between spoonfuls. She's not joking. That night, a horn sounds from the outer ridge. Raiders, small party, likely probing defenses rather than launching a full assault. Still, the Countess is already in boots and mail by the time you've tripped over your cloak. She orders the gates closed. Not slammed, mind you. Just shut with the kind of ceremony that says, "Come back with better manners." The fortress flickers to life. Torches, signals, a surprisingly well-rehearsed goose defense squad. You take a position beside the eastern parapet, holding a slingshot you don't quite know how to use. The monk beside you gives a shrug and loads a pocketful of pebbles. The raiders don't breach the wall, not even close. One loses his balance on a slick rock and slides halfway down the slope. Another is gently but firmly chased off by the aforementioned geese. You hear the Countess shout something encouraging from the tower window, possibly about soup. Historians still debate the scope of noblewomen's power in early Asturias, especially those like Adosinda, who were daughters of kings, wives of dukes, and rumored generals when the mood struck. But when you watch her stand at dawn, arms crossed, hair braided into a knot that says, "Try me," it's hard to imagine anyone telling her no. The next day, repairs begin. Children gather stones for the wall. A young page is ordered to repaint the shield mural after accidentally depicting the enemy commander with surprisingly nice eyebrows. The kitchen staff roasts the stolen fish and names the chicken a hero. Addisonda checks the armory, then the chapel, then sits down and mends a tunic with needlework so precise it could be mistaken for a map. Before you leave, she hands you a small parcel, dried fruit, 3 arrowheads, and a note that reads, "Hold the gate when others won't." You nod, bow low, and try not to trip on the way out. The mist wraps the fortress behind you, and her voice echoes once more, this time softer, like a lullaby, dressed as an order. "Tell them we endured." You wake to the sound of kneading, wet, rhythmic, and suspiciously deliberate. Someone is making bread, which in Asturias often means someone is up to something. Today, your task is simple. Escort a loaf to a nearby parish. Except, of course, this isn't just any loaf. It's dense, slightly lopsided, and weighs more than your head. That's because, buried deep inside, wrapped in waxed linen and tucked like a raisin in the middle of history, is a scroll. Asturias has no formal postal service, and royal dispatches don't travel well by goat. So the monks, ever resourceful, have turned to barley loaves as edible couriers. The logic is sound. No one suspects the bread. And even if they do, they'll need a very sharp knife and very little regard for dinner to find the message. You sling the loaf into a basket, tuck a second one in beside it, just in case, and begin your trek. The hills are quiet today, except for the occasional thud of an acorn landing too close for comfort. You pass a pair of shepherds arguing whether St. Martin ever actually owned a goat, and a child tying flowers to a chicken's leg as a form of blessing. The path is winding, lined with trees that lean like curious old men. You cross a stream with a stone bridge so crooked, it looks like it was designed mid-sneeze. Halfway across, you stop to retie your sandal and notice a carving under the arch. A small loaf, etched with careful detail, beside a scroll and a smiling frog. A quiet reminder that Asturian secrecy sometimes wears silly shoes. By mid-afternoon, you reach the chapel. It's squat, half buried in ivy, and home to a priest named Father Aurelio, who greets you with suspicion and then a smile. Possibly in that order every time. You hand him the loaf. He weighs it, knocks on it, then slices into it like a man performing surgery on a particularly dense pudding. Inside the scroll, he unrolls it carefully. On it, a list of names, troop movements near the Duero, and a warning in elegant script. Harvest quietly, move west, leave no grain behind. He nods solemnly, then hands you a bit of the crust. "Still warm," he says. They're getting good at this. Historians still argue whether these message loaves were a widespread tactic or just a regional oddity. Some dismiss them as folklore. Others point to monastic records and the alarming number of half-eaten archives. Regardless, the bread speaks quietly, urgently, and occasionally with raisins. As night falls, you stay the night in the chapel's attic, where saints stare down from cracked murals and mice make gentle announcements with their tiny feet. You dream of scrolls that unfold into songs, of letters hidden in jam jars, and of kings writing manifestos on napkins. On your return journey, you stop by a mill house, where the baker, An older woman with arms like tree trunks and a smile that could shatter siege morale offers you a normal loaf. You tap it, weigh it, sniff it. Just bread. Probably. She winks and slides another into your bag. For your next sermon, she says, you're not a priest, but you don't argue with someone who has both yeast and secrets on their side. That evening, you arrive back at the monastery. The kitchen is humming, the bells are tolling, and Brother Julian is trying, again, to toast parchment. You slip the empty basket back on its hook and settle in by the fire. There's a quiet satisfaction to knowing that a kingdom's survival sometimes depends not on swords or speeches, but on crumb structure. And as you drift to sleep, with the scent of flour and candle wax in the air, you imagine an empire of messages, moving silently beneath crust and grain, whispering through ovens, "We are still here." The king has mud on his knees. Again, you've grown used to this by now. After all, King Fruela. Which Fruela? Let's just say, the most Fruela-ish of them all, is a ruler whose royal regalia often includes gardening gloves. He's out in the barley fields at dawn, muttering to himself about irrigation while gently scolding a mole for excessive tunneling. This is not the sort of king who parades. This is the sort of king who composts. Fruela Seki, though historians still argue whether the tales we hear best fit him, or a hodgepodge of multiple Fruelas over time, is remembered in these hills not for shining armor or grand speeches, but for something much rarer: quiet competence and a stubborn affection for root vegetables. You first meet him in a muddy courtyard where he's planting onions and discussing taxation policy with a pig farmer. His crown is nowhere to be seen. In fact, most people suspect it's propping up a window somewhere in the chancery. Inside the royal hall, which is really just a sturdier barn with better windows, decisions are made over bowls of soup. The court scribe has to pause every few minutes to dry his parchment over the hearth. The queen, meanwhile, is in the corner, mending a tear in the kingdom's only decent banner. You offer to help and are handed a thimble with little ceremony and a lot of expectation. Fruela holds audience under a pear tree when the weather allows. There's no throne, just a wide bench and a habit of handing visitors apples before he lets them complain. Disputes are often resolved with mild threats, thoughtful proverbs, and sometimes an unexpected loaf of bread. One memorable incident involved two noble cousins arguing over inheritance until Fruela asked them both to spend the winter managing beehives. They never argued again, possibly due to the bees. Historians still argue whether Fruela genuinely preferred manual labor, or if this was an elaborate performance of humility. But the records, such as they are, suggest he spent more time with monks than warriors, and more time in the fields than on horseback. That isn't to say the kingdom was peaceful. Asturias still had raiders, local feuds, and the occasional ambitious cousin with more horses than common sense. But Fruela's strength lay in refusing to meet chaos with grandeur. When attacked, he rebuilt. When slighted, he baked bread. When asked to explain his policies, he pointed to his barley yield and said, "It grows." You spend an afternoon with him walking the orchard. He quizzes you gently on local saints and the best season to prune fig trees. Later, in the library, he shows you his personal scroll collection, theology texts, planting almanacs, and one extremely detailed recipe for mead. He pauses before a worn page, fingers tracing the ink. A kingdom, he murmurs, is a lot like bread. You knead it, stretch it, leave it alone just long enough, and hope it rises. You nod wisely. You're not entirely sure what it means, but you're hungry, and it sounds delicious. That evening, the court gathers for supper. There's stew with chestnuts, cheese wrapped in bracken, and wine stored in a jug shaped like a duck. The king toasts the stubborn hills and those who farm them. Someone tries to sing. Someone else, thankfully, stops them. As the stars prick the sky outside and the fire settles into its whisper, Fruela scribbles a few notes in the margins of a tax roll. You lean over and catch the words, "Let those who till the earth rule it gently." And in that quiet moment, with the taste of apple still on your tongue and the sound of the mountain wind murmuring just beyond the shutter, you understand. This was never a kingdom of glory. It was a kingdom of endurance. And kings like Fruela were its heartbeat. Steady, unspectacular, and always muddy. The night tastes of figs and nervous diplomacy. You've been summoned, though summoned might be a strong word for invited by a monk with honey on his sleeve to witness a most unusual gathering. Under the cloak of dusk, in a sheltered hollow just beyond the monastery orchard, a diplomatic meeting is quietly taking shape. The hosts are Asturian monks, the guests are from the Umayyad south. It's not exactly an official royal summit. There are no heralds, no flags, and definitely no trumpets. Just a wool-draped table under a tree, clay lanterns flickering like sleepy fireflies, and enough food to distract even the sternest negotiator. The guests arrive on horseback, their cloaks dusted with travel, their eyes scanning every rustling branch. They are emissaries of Al-Andalus, men of letters and law, wearing robes that catch the candlelight like river silk. Their mounts are tired, their expressions are polite and unreadable. They bow, not deeply, but just enough to mean, "We are here. We are listening." The monks respond in the way monks often do, with bread, wine, and softly murmured Latin. Brother Aurelio offers figs dipped in honey. The southern delegation accepts them cautiously. A younger monk attempts to pour wine and nearly drops the jug. Everyone pretends not to notice. You take your seat on a wool cushion, tucked just behind a basket of dates. From here, diplomacy looks less like statecraft and more like an awkward dinner party. One man is trying to explain the theological differences between two saints. Another is drawing pictures in the dust to describe watermills. Someone else just complimented the stew in very formal Arabic, and a monk replied by handing him more cheese. Historians still argue whether such meetings had the approval of the court in Cordoba, or if they were merely tolerated, loose threads in a tapestry far too large to monitor. But in this moment, what matters is that no one is fighting. Instead, they are offering each other stories. An Asturian monk tells of the time a bear wandered into a baptism and refused to leave. A southern scholar counters with a tale of a stork who nested atop a minaret for 15 years. Laughter ripples through the leaves. Someone uncorks a second jug. Then comes the quiet part, the exchange of scrolls. No fanfare, just a passing of hands under the table's edge. Lists of village names, market prices, rainfall patterns, tribute agreements, perhaps, or maps drawn from memory and guesswork. One scroll is sealed with beeswax and smells faintly of lavender. Another bears a strange symbol, half crescent, half cross. It is tucked quickly beneath a monk's sleeve. You are offered a pastry. You accept. It's shaped like a star and filled with crushed walnuts. The southern envoy beside you smiles and says, "It's a good kingdom, this one, a little stubborn. Like a goat." You nod. You've met the goats. They'd make excellent diplomats. As the moon rises, the conversation slows. The guests are weary, the monks gently blinking with wine-softened eyes. The negotiations, if they were negotiations, seem to have gone well. No gold was exchanged, no borders redrawn, but the peace lingers like a second blanket. Before leaving, one of the Umayyad envoys presents a gift, a brass astrolabe, delicate as a spiderweb, polished to a glow. The monks gasp. One kisses it reverently. In return, Brother Aurelio offers a carved wooden box filled with honeycomb, parchment, and a single feather quill wrapped in dyed wool. They part without formal farewell, just nods, half smiles, and one whispered line from a southern poet. We drink from different wells, but the moon sees us both. You walk back to the monastery with Brother Julian, who is already trying to translate the stork poem into rustic Latin. He says, "This was important, wasn't it?" And you nod again, though you're not sure why your chest feels like a full wineskin. Because this, you realize, is what kingdoms do when they're not shouting. They pass bread, tell strange jokes, and choose, for a few hours, not to fight. You sleep that night with fig-sweet breath and stars above your head, dreaming of scrolls that cross mountains without a guard. Morning comes slow and green, rolling over the hills like a breath exhaled from centuries ago. The mists settle in lazy folds around the trees, and the monastery bell rings low and steady, not to summon or alarm, but just to say, yes, the kingdom is still here. Only, it isn't. Not entirely. You feel the shift in the road beneath your feet. Cobblestones appear where there were once dirt paths. The language spoken by merchants sounds softer, more southern, the cadence tilting toward Leon. Even the goats seem slightly more dignified. Asturias, as a kingdom, is fading, not with a crash, but with a long sigh into something larger. The capital moves south, closer to the old Roman roads. Kings begin calling themselves rulers of Leon instead. And though the name Asturias still lingers in documents and dreams, it's no longer at the center of the map. But this isn't loss, it's transformation. You walk the familiar ridge path above Covadonga, where it all began with a damp cave and a desperate prayer. The cave is still there, stone cold and candlelit, the cross now replaced with one that gleams faintly in the afternoon sun. A few pilgrims kneel in silence, whispering things to the rock. No one rushes them. Time moves slowly here. As you pass through an orchard, once managed by King Fuela himself, though it now grows figs instead of turnips, you meet a young girl named Aurea. She's carrying a basket of walnuts and wearing a crown of woven reeds. When you ask what she's playing, she says, quite seriously, "Queen of the Apples, Defender of the Hill." Then she curtsies and offers you a walnut in tribute. You accept. It's cracked, but delicious. Further down the slope, you visit a church with worn frescoes. The saints are still there, along with a faint image of a bear curled beneath their feet. You smile, remembering Gregorio. The priest nods when you ask. "Ah, yes, Brother Bear," he says. "Part of our old stories. Some say he comes back, now and then, to check on things." Inside, a monk is copying hymns in a room that smells of thyme and lamp oil. He hums as he writes, the tune old and vaguely familiar. You realize you've heard it before, sung at vespers, hummed during honeymaking, whistled by a passing noblewoman defending her fortress, a melody that never quite left the hills. Historians still debate whether Asturias truly existed as an independent power, or if it was simply the seed of something greater. Was it a kingdom, a rebellion that lasted longer than expected, a hilltop dream with good PR? You don't know. But as you wander the lanes where bees still roam freely, where messages are still occasionally smuggled in loaves, out of habit, if not necessity, and where children build kingdoms out of moss and slate, you know that it mattered. It mattered because it endured. Not in pageantry or conquest, but in the hush between bells, the weight of silence in a stone cave, the call of one shepherd to another in the fog. The markets may now speak of Leon. The royal scrolls may bear different seals, but in the cracks between cobblestones, the story of Asturias still breathes. And when you finally reach the highest hill, wind in your cloak, and the valley stretched wide below, you hear it, not loudly, but clearly. The soft song of monks preparing for vespers, the creak of a fortress gate, just tested for creaks out of tradition, the sleepy grunt of a bear very far away, the whisper of a kingdom still wrapped in clouds and candles and quiet courage. You sit. Let the view fill your chest. Let the moss cool your hands. Let the story settle around you like a blanket. You made it to the end and the beginning again. Now, the hills begin to fold themselves in like blankets tucked around the weary. The wind eases, no longer pressing questions into the stone, but instead humming soft lullabies into the trees. Your step slow, not from fatigue, but from the comfort of knowing there's nowhere left to rush. Asturias may not sit on maps the way it once did, but in these quiet places, in the flicker of a candle behind monastery walls, in the warm crust of bread hiding one last secret, it lives on. You've walked beside kings who dig, queens who scold with gentle precision, monks who chant while feeding bears, and farmers who defend their lands with onions and hope. You've listened to stories stitched into silence and seen history, not in gold or banners, but in barley and beeswax and the turn of the seasons. And now, as night comes gently through the leaves, you rest. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the mountain winds. Let your thoughts settle like parchment dust. Let your mind drift toward the caves and cloisters, the warm kitchens and mossy paths, the lull of a world where nothing was easy. But everything was kept, carefully, stubbornly, alive. You are safe here. The past is kind, the present is drowsy, and the stars are patient. So breathe, let go. And if you dream of carved wooden geese, of scrolls that smell like flour, or of bears sleeping beside monks, just know the kingdom remembers you too. Sweet dreams, my children.